Well, hello, heathens, and welcome back to some more Godless politics. Today we're going to be looking at the budget plans of the presidential candidates. Y'all had some very awesome comments last time, so as I go through this list, I would love for you to leave your comments down below on each candidate's budget plan, and I'll try to respond to them as best as I can. So first up is Donald Trump. In general, Donald Trump opposes a stimulus from the Federal Reserve, and he also opposes raising the debt ceiling. Okay, I don't think that that's necessarily a budget plan, but at least we know what you're not into there, buddy. Trump claims that the Federal Reserve actually bought up a whole bunch of mortgage debt in order to manipulate the number that they released to the public, and that this would cause inflation. Although I don't think that he actually knows what inflation is, because simply looking at what inflation is, being the devaluing of the US dollar, and if you just correlate that to the chart of, the value of the US dollar, around the time that he says that this would have devalued it, the US dollar actually went up in value. Obviously, he was just trying to fearmonger people into, not trusting the Federal Reserve and the numbers that they were putting out. But of course, this all makes sense because he is a real estate mogul, and the government buying up a whole bunch of mortgage debt is not going to be all that great for him as far as profit goes. Pretty simply put, Donald Trump is about making money. If he can't make money with it, then it's useless to him. That's why he's went bankrupt 4 times. And he opposes raising the debt ceiling, even though his debt plan would raise our deficit by like a few trillion. Well, okay, a few trillion now. Before, though, with his original tax plan, it would have raised it by about 10 trillion. But now it's just about 5 or 6. And you know what his solution is? Print more money! That's why I don't think that he actually knows what inflation actually is, because, if we actually print more money and we have more banknotes floating around, that means that each individual note is going to be worth a whole lot less. Not that the dollar value on the actual banknote, like $20, it's not like $20 is all of a sudden going to be worth 15 or something like that, but in the world of global currency, it's going to be devalued. You're going to have to trade in more US dollars in order to get the same amount in Canadian dollars or Canadian money. I mean, the money that we have printed up for banknotes kind of represents the amount of wealth that we have as a country in general. And just, logic dictates that the more notes you have representing that pile of gold is going to be worth less for each note. If you were to trade it outside of the system. But also inflation, what it does is it drives up prices of products and services. He has also claimed that Paul Ryan from 2012 has a catastrophic budget plan, but I really don't think that he knows exactly what was in Paul Ryan's budget plan. Now, Paul Ryan would have ended up spending $5.3 trillion less, and I'm fairly certain that is going to be any presidential candidate's goal is to actually spend less, or at least reappropriate monies, into spending them more, a lot smarter. Paul Ryan was going to cut Medicaid and Medicare, as well as income security, transportation, and even cutting the amount spent on veterans. Another area that he was going to cut is general science, space, and basic technology. Honestly, looking at Paul Ryan's budget, I really don't know if Trump actually looked at Paul Ryan's budget or if he just saw a few little things and then just automatically said that it was catastrophic, because these are the things that Donald Trump would cut in general. So I really don't think that he knows, or maybe he has reverted on some of his opinions from 2012. Maybe he doesn't consider Paul Ryan's budget to be catastrophic. Paul Ryan would have also cut the amount of money spent on infrastructure in our country. Personally, I would expect Donald Trump to shift all of the infrastructure costs onto the states, which would inevitably cause the states to raise their taxes. I mean, with Republicans consistently wanting smaller and smaller government, it seems like pushing off a whole bunch of the responsibilities that are currently allocated to the federal government onto the state governments is kind of like a logical conclusion. Next up is Hillary Clinton. In general, Hillary Clinton wants to spend more in communities that have a long history of poverty. Also, she wants to invest $275 billion on infrastructure to encourage productiveness, competition, and strengthen the economy. Now, I will say that her budget seems to be a bit smarter of an approach than Trump has. Little of an approach he has. And I say this because she's wanting to invest in low-income areas. She's actually wanting to implement this 10-20-30 plan that was proposed by Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Basically, the 10-20-30 plan would be that each department reserves 10% of their budget to spend on low-income neighborhoods where 20% of the neighborhood is below the poverty level for the past 30 years. I mean, I see this really being a good thing because focusing on poverty in our country, I would say has to be one of those up there on the top priorities list because poverty works its way into just about every single facet of our life. And especially like crime statistics, poverty and crime have a pretty hard correlation to each other. The more poverty-stricken areas there are, the more crime that there's going to be because more people have more incentive to commit crime because they live in, impoverished conditions. The 10-20-30 plan would definitely stimulate local economies and help drive the poverty level down. It's estimated that about $200 billion to $275 billion each budget year is what is needed to fix our infrastructure for like the next 10 years. Currently, right now, Clinton is wanting to allocate $275 billion to fixing our infrastructure. I think that investing in our infrastructure is a very important thing because, the shit's been up for a while now, and we're obviously not paying any kind of attention to our infrastructure, and one day we're going to be paying for that, whether it's out of our pockets or with people's lives. But investing in our infrastructure would definitely create jobs and as well as help pull some people out of poverty-stricken areas. But Clinton even goes a step further and explains exactly how she's going to pay for this investment in infrastructure. She would pay for it by closing corporate tax loopholes, which a lot of you have mentioned, in my discussions with you guys, and I appreciate all those discussions. But she plans on closing these loopholes as well as getting rid of cuts that benefit the rich. She says specifically that she will end preference for companies that stash their profit in overseas banks in order to avoid U.S. taxes, and ending a corporate tax loophole that allows large companies to avoid taxes by moving their headquarters overseas, which I know is what a lot of you are concerned about. So that is a very important issue. Now, Clinton does have a track record of supporting $1.2 billion in earmarks as a senator, supporting an economic stimulus package to help low-income families, and supporting a balanced budget amendment. Personally, I feel like she has a set of attainable goals where she doesn't explicitly state like how much she's going to be cutting back or whatnot. I think that it's a better move not to be too specific on that, just because if you become too specific, then you're setting yourself up kind of for failure because you're not really sure if you're going to be able to attain. But I would bet that she has some general figures in her head that she's really playing close to the vest so that she doesn't set herself up for any kind of failure if she does win the presidential seat. This is in stark contrast to the other candidates that speak so surely about exactly what they can accomplish in office, as if it were to say, be more like my way or the highway. I'm looking at you, Gary Johnson. Next up is Gary Johnson. In general, Gary Johnson wants to balance the budget by rejecting pressure from special interest groups. He wants to push through a balanced budget amendment, as well as cut the budget by 20%, including cuts to the military, Medicaid, and Medicare. Now, honestly, I really don't see how rejecting pressure from special interest groups ends up balancing budget. I get that you don't want to succumb to these special interest groups and end up unfairly, budgeting things out, but I don't see how that results in a balanced budget. I still think that you could have an unbalanced budget even if you reject special interest groups. And I mean, even assuming that you can do that kind of suggests that you have the final say in the budget. But I know Gary Johnson knows that even on the budget, like with his time in as a governor of New Mexico, he vetoed a budget, but the House and the senators, they actually overturned his veto. So that is still very much an option. While Gary Johnson thinks that he has the final say on the budget, whether or not it gets passed, he really doesn't. There are steps taken to assure that the president doesn't have absolute control. We don't want a president with absolute control. That would be more like a monarchy rather than a democratic republic. Now, I will say that a balanced budget amendment is a good idea. If you don't know what the balanced budget amendment is, a lot of people have been trying to push a balanced budget amendment into the Constitution. What a balanced budget is when the government doesn't budget more than it actually takes in. So basically it's either break even or come out positive on the budget. This, of course, would prevent us from adding to the deficit, but it definitely doesn't, help us pay anything off if we only break even. Depending on how you budget. I guess that you could work into the budget paying a little bit of the deficit off, but it really just depends on how you budget. But one thing that I'm afraid of with a balanced budget amendment is the continuous passing of temporary budgets in order to get some kind of balance. If you guys don't know, we've had some trouble with that lately, getting a budget passed through Congress. It keeps getting pushed off and pushed off and pushed off, and you have to pass these temporary budgets that'll get us through till when we can just push it off again. I'm afraid that this amendment would sincerely advocate for that kind of measure, because if we don't have a balanced budget, then we'll have to pass a temporary budget or else the government will shut down. And we've done that a few times in the past, so we're not afraid to actually shut the government down. I do find that this amendment could possibly get us thinking in a more creative fashion about how to bring our GDP up so that we can increase our budget. That's one positive outcome for this amendment, as well as not adding to our deficit. Now, both Johnson and his running mate Weld scored decently by the Cato Institute on spending and cuts to the budget. During their times as governor, they were able to get the budget, cut down and spend less each year, with Johnson getting B's through his tenure and then Weld getting B's and A's. The less that you spend on this scale, the higher the grade you get, just to give you a reference point. I do think that this only gives a partial view of the current situation. I think that you would have to look at how the states of New Mexico and Massachusetts did as, their time there, which, if you really take that into consideration with the fact that, Johnson wants to push Medicaid off onto, the states, he would have ended up spending a whole lot more, and his track record by the Cato Institute would have been much worse. One thing that a president needs to do is be able to get both sides of the House and the Senate to come to some kind of compromise on budgets. Well, Gary Johnson doesn't exactly have a good track of that. Back when he was a governor, he had a 60% Democratic legislature, and he was still unable to get a budget passed in 2003. He vetoed the budget given to them, and even the legislature was able to band together and override his veto. That is another big concern of mine, because we need a president that can go to the legislature and try to come to some kind of compromise, or at least persuade them to come to some kind of compromise. The way that we, traditionally have done it. But not only that, but it's the only way that we can really work together to get, America, quote unquote, make it great again. Cutting Medicare and Medicaid from the budget completely and delegating it to the states is an incredibly bad idea. Not only is that going to put the financial burden on the states to provide the Medicare and Medicaid, but that will cause the taxes to go up, or for Medicare and Medicaid to either not exist in that state or to be so poverty-stricken that it would almost be useless. And finally, we have Jill Stein. Now, of course, as with Jill Stein's other stance, she doesn't exactly elaborate on how she would do these things, but she just says things that a lot of people want to hear. In general, Jill Stein wants to have a massive job creation program to boost the economy. And she wants to reduce the deficit by creating jobs, cutting military spending, and changing how income is taxed. Now, she compares this massive job creation to the New Deal. But you see, the problem is that when the New Deal was going down in the 30s and 40s, we actually ended up spending a shit ton more of money, because that's what it takes in order to create jobs, is you got to spend more money in order to make these jobs come into existence. Not to say that the New Deal didn't need to happen or anything like that. I think it very much did. But with the fact that she's wanting to cut the deficit by doing a few things, doesn't really make sense, considering that she's planning on adding to the deficit while also trying to take it back. If she had said that, she doesn't want to cut the deficit, but she would rather not add to the deficit by cutting this stuff and creating more jobs, that would make sense. But as it stands now, I don't see how she can, not add. I don't see how she can not add to the deficit, but also create jobs at the same time. Now, she says that she wants to send the military budget back to the 2000 numbers, but in 2000, the military had a budget of about $385 billion. Now, it's nearly twice that, but I don't think that she can exactly get us back to that level of spending in a 4-year time period. If she's been given 8 years, maybe, but I think over a 4-year time period, she's not going to get anywhere near the year 2000 levels of military spending. I mean, we've obviously grown our military, but we're also deployed across the world. I mean, you can't exactly cut the funding off of that just right there and leave our assets out there in the wind. There are some things, though, that she mentions that I'm completely on board with, like the Medicare for All system. This is, of course, the same system that Bernie Sanders was spearheading on his campaign. I completely support the idea, and it could definitely save a lot of money, like in the trillions. But it's not going to save the U.S. government trillions of dollars, but it'll save the taxpayer and businesses a lot of money. The thing I know that a lot of people were against on the Bernie Sanders front was the fact that it would add a little bit to our taxes. But if you really consider it, we have to pay a little bit more in taxes, but yet we don't have that pesky, amount that we have to pay every month for our insurance. Then I think that it's a worthy enough trade. One thing that I disagree with on her about the Medicare for All system is that she paints it as if it's going to save the government trillions of dollars. Like, I don't know if maybe that's just my reading of it or whatnot. My perception could be skewed, but it just seems to me like she is trying to paint it as saving trillions of dollars for the U.S. government rather than the taxpayer. Other things that I agree with include a 0.5% sales tax for Wall Street, she says gamblers, taxing capital gains, and a progressive income tax code. All of these things sound like awesome ideas. But honestly, I would rather hear more on how she's going to implement these things and not necessarily seeing specific numbers, but really seeing more of an idea as to how to get it paid. Because as it stands right now, I don't really see how she's planning on paying for the things that she wants to do. Now, if she's just going to be continuously adding to the debt, fine, say that. But don't paint yourself as cutting the deficit when you're only adding to it. Well, thank you guys for joining me today on this Godless Politics. If you will, leave all your comments down below. I would love to hear all of them and discuss them with you. And if you will, subscribe to the channel if this is your first time here. Leave me a like, because that'll help me out a whole bunch. And I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a nice day. Now, I know, it's Trump, and that should be enough of a reason not to vote for his ass. But I do have a couple of weird reasons why you maybe shouldn't for it, is because it has, references to a deity in it. Now, these references to a deity don't actually reflect what, we practice here in America today. Because at the very end of the pledge, it says, one nation under God, indivisible, and blah, blah, blah. It says that, but by